Welcome to our podcast, And Then What? Tales of Practical Mysticism, with my friend Marilynn Hughes. Today we talk about what St. Francis and St. Clare of Assisi might say in response to the current climate emergency that has so enveloped the world. What kind of practical things can we do in our lives to develop a better life and a hopefully more hopeful future for our children and grandchildren?
Well, okay, so what would St. Francis and St. Clare say? It's a good question. I don't know. I think, I think that I would probably add to both St. Francis and St. Clare and throw my good friend St. Padre Pio in because he was he was a Capuchin friar too,
Hmm.
or Franciscan friar too. And the thing that he would always say was, pray and don't worry. Um, I think that the what what we do know about the ecology issues is very hard to interpret because some of the scientists are saying that we're warming, and then there have been recent reports saying that we're actually cooling. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so whether how that impacts things, I don't know in terms of whether it makes it worse or less worse or whatever. But we've had these kinds of things happen many times over the past several decades, where scientists have predicted like the world would come to an end within 7 to 10 years because of ecological issues. And I think that's highly unlikely unless we're dealing with an asteroid hit or like an actual polar shift that would occur of the actual Earth shifting its gravitational pull, which can happen, But unless something much more dramatic like that were to happen, I doubt we're looking at a world ending event. But what we also have to remember is that the Earth itself is a living organism and that it is able to renew itself, and it has many times.
That's
So,
fantastic. And I just learned in Korea that from a Hungarian scientist, physicist, who told me that the sun too is a living entity. And that blew me away because I mean I know that intuitively, but for him to say to affirm that was quite fascinating.
yeah, it is. And I've had mystical experiences where I'm taken into the sun. And, there's some really interesting spiritual pathways through the sun. And yes, the heavenly bodies, I wrote about this in the Mysteries of the Redemption. The stars. These were part of the reasons why ancient man was so intrigued with the constellations and stuff, because they had an awareness that the stars were quote unquote heavenly beings, And so some of the angelic hierarchy literally does come from the stars, and some of them are literally energized and are like an extension of a star. One of the beings that I spoke of in the Mysteries of the Redemption, her name was Quasar, and she was a star, but she would appear in the form of a Native American woman who would teach me.
Mm.
But at one point, she took me out of body to a quasar star to show me who she really was. So, ancient man had some concept of this, that stars were uh, big bundles of energy, and they're living beings, and that they're part of this universal hierarchy, and the angelic hierarchy as well. So I think, knowing St. Francis and St. Clare, St. Clare would probably respond by because she was someone who was called to a life of continual prayer. She would tell us to pray. St.
Right.
Francis, on the other hand, who was more of a missionary spirit, but also he prayed a lot as well.
Hmm.
But he would tell us to embrace the simplicity, because St. Francis, that's what he was all about, was embracing the simplicity. Even
Hmm.
Mother Teresa did this in her work in Calcutta. where um, she was very, very much a stickler for using only what they needed. So if things were offered or donated that she didn't think they would need, she's saying, no, we don't need that. And so she would keep things down to the very, very bare necessities to take care of the dying and take care of the poor. But she was very, very simple in that way. So the simplicity is something that we see like in the life of St. Francis and the followers of St. Francis, as well as, just lives of some of the saints like Mother Teresa, where you pull back all the extraneous matter that we've put together in our modern world. We do see that if there is going to be a major change that has to occur, uh, what will happen will be something that humans really won't have a lot of control over, which will be the earth will renew herself. So what will happen is, just like when the dinosaurs existed, when other things happen, there will be an ice age or there will be an asteroid hit. Human beings will be expelled from the earth, and the earth would be able to replenish, restore, renew. So as human beings, there's a reasonable chance that maybe we wouldn't make it through that, or only a small remnant would. But if that were to happen, but the more likely path would be that in terms of recognizing the difficulties that we're facing climatologically, that we make changes in the way that we build civilization. Because it's only been since the early 1900s that we really started using the types of machinery and scientific development that created all the CO2 problems and things like that. Right. So certainly we can come up with new ways and new technologies that will come into play. Even in the United States, there's a lot of the windmill farms that have been built. There's a lot of solar that's being used. Obviously, a lot more of those kinds of things would have to be utilized if we're going to remove the CO2 footprint completely. I don't think it's realistic that that can be done in 5 to 10 years.
That's interesting. I just posted an article on LinkedIn and argued that if globally we eliminated our debt money systems, if we lived the Lord's Prayer by the letter, which he said, forgive us our debts. He didn't use the word trespass, as we have for many years in the Catholic tradition. We would effectively could reduce absolute greenhouse gas emissions by at least 20 to 25% immediately, because
really
it's the average American today is spending 52% of their time, their work week, working for hidden interest charges on the $71 trillion of unrepayable debt outstanding. These are numbers that are staggering and nobody talks about them. And so we have all this emotion. We have lovely teenagers like Greta Thunberg, marching our streets, but it would take enormous courage of the world leaders, and Pope Francis has kind of talked about this. But imagine eliminating one of the key drivers for the reason the economy has to grow, reducing our work week by half, simply by taking out the reason we have to work, and returning the power of money to a public utility that we all control, not the private banks. And some people might think I'm a ridiculous dreamer, that this will never happen, right? That the bankers of the world will never agree. But Henry Ford once said, if people knew how simple money is created, there'd be a revolution tomorrow. So these are things I think Francis would probably also applaud, saying we created these systems, and if we also move to a life of more frugality and simplicity, we would also reduce our carbon footprint, our ecological footprint enormously. But of course, the reason we have a growth economy is because, and the reason we're so materialistic in part is because we're encouraged to work more than we have to. And so you could see there's a key relationship there, a driver of why the economic growth has to continue. And there's no, people say, well, I can't afford not to, can't afford not to be producing stuff and trading. And if you take away that driver, wow, what a freedom that would, present.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what you're saying is really kind of what St. Francis embodied in his ministry, which was, literally pulling back all of the dross from life in the Middle Ages at the time of his life to the point where they had the freedom to live within the way that the world worked, and so they lived very much in harmony with, they rebuilt the church, and they had all this extra time then to add the praying um, and they, brother sun and sister moon and
Yeah, thank you
uh,
for saying those two lines, because that's fascinating. Brother,
yeah,
sun, sister, moon, right?
yeah.
Relational. No,
Yeah, yeah, exactly true. Yeah, and the reality is that, well, and he speaks about all the creatures. One of my favorite parts of Saint Francis's life is when he preaches to the animals, and there's several different instances in his life. One is where he preaches to the birds. There's another one where he preaches to the fish, and and what I love about this with St. Francis is that there's this recognition of the life within the creatures as well. And when you read these accountings of St. Francis and what he was doing, it talks about how even the fish and the birds, they came to a place of quiet and respect when St. Francis would preach about God, because they understood that he was speaking about our great creator,
right.
and so some really
That's
great moments in these lives of St. Francis that are written in
yeah.
the book.
And let me also share my indigenous understanding. When indigenous people or First Nations, or when they enter the sweat lodge, which is their church, right?
Right.
They say all my relations. So all my relations means every creature, every two-legged, four-legged, right? Um,
Yes.
those are all our relations. And so very much like Francis, you know, they, you know, they maintain those beautiful traditions of being in relationship with nature all the time. And actually a reverence, such a great reverence that they understood that all creation kind of is also in beautiful harmony and in loving relationship with us as humanity. And so imagine kind of my image, all of creation holds its breath, simply waiting for humanity to say thank you, you know. So
Well
again,
said.
this is getting our relationship right, which is, I think, part of the healing that has to occur. But maybe it won't happen in time. Maybe a lot of us will get wiped out because of our own
I do
whatever.
think there's a couple of ways to look at this. One is, there's only so much control we have as human beings, and so
Mm,
part of what we want to do is, uh, we don't want to live our lives in fear of something like that happening, because if it happens, it happens. We are mortal beings. We know this, so we know that, we all live and we all die here. This is not a
yeah,
permanent abode. Secondly, however, though, even going back to what you were mentioning about young people marching and stuff, my suggestion, and I believe St. Francis and St. Clare would probably echo this in today's world, is stop marching. Take a look at what some of the people, we've seen some people, and some of them are older, some of them are young, who are coming up with brilliant ways to do things that improve the
th-
ecological situation on the earth. We
thank
have
you.
people,
Yeah,
yeah, we have people who, rather than waste their time marching and complaining that other people aren't doing enough, they've gone out and they are cleaning the plastic out of the oceans. There was this one young man who found a way, he was a scientist, to clean out these really disgusting ponds and lakes that have been polluted. And he's got this process that he's created where we can start renewing our earth with things like this. And there are so many other people coming up with um, neat ideas, and that's what we need people to be doing, is using their special gifts for their little corner of this problem,
I think
rather.
yeah, that's such a powerful statement. I totally agree. And I think you will find everywhere these pockets of innovation, right?
Yeah,
Entrepreneurs engineers who are coming. We know we can clean up water bodies. We can. Why can't we just scoop up all the plastic and render it back into biodiesel? Or we have technology to do that. And but none of that makes the headline news. So you're
right.
right. I think the small acts of love, they're the ones that add up, actually.
They are. They absolutely add up much more than the I personally find it irritating when I just see people marching all the time, because it just comes across sometimes as, well, okay, let's keep complaining instead of actually taking positive action,
Well,
regardless of what the issues are about. You
yeah.
know what I mean?
And I know as an economist, if actually people, like I'm an economic villain because we don't consume as much as maybe the average, citizen, because we don't actually have any debt. So it was like, well, that means we don't have to work as much. Uh, and we can live I already have way too much stuff. You could tell I have too many books. I'm not going to burn my books, but but it's fascinating, right? So those who live a life of frugality, like if St. Francis was an absolute villain to, Italy's GDP or
Yeah.
Assisi's, GDP, if there was no such measure then. But today, to live a life of simplicity is a villain to economic development. But all those little choices will add up. And
Yeah, and it goes across the board. We see this not just with ecology, but we see it with um, at the risk of bringing up something real controversial in the U.S. is, the racism issue. People marching about the racism issue, and it's like, why don't people stop marching and just start treating each other better?
can't,
It's just,
can't we just practice kindness and compassion?
yeah,
We're hardwired to do. And,
yeah,
and the truth is, most of us, when found in those situations where we might have been scared or had a bias, we'll find compassion and listening to the other story. I mean,
right.
you see it over and over again. But yeah, we get all hyped up on Twitter or, the latest crazy YouTube video that shows, this kind of hatred, which is just it's just so useless. I mean,
It is useless, and what it does is it actually multiplies the hatred or the problems rather than doing anything to simplify. And even in the mystical experiences I've had with Saint Francis and Saint Clare, it's always about the simplification. There's a lot of prayer involved in those experiences that I have mystically with them. I'm always put on my knees, and but there's also this simplicity that we have to go back to, and that's what I think is, even in just choosing to take actions that are going to work towards a better future for all, is a simplistic action.
yes,
Not every one of us is going to have the brilliance to figure out how to pick up the plastic and convert it to biodiesel, but we do have people who have the education who do. So not everyone is going to be out there and have a brilliant idea ecologically. However, we can all be responsible about our own ecological footprint, that way we handle our own trash, the way we handle our own energy.
yeah,
We do the best that we can, and we use the gifts that we are given. And we have a lot of young people who have been brought into the world at this time for this very purpose. That's why we're seeing all these really ingenious ideas, because God is smarter than us and he predicted this before any of us did. So, he started sending the troops in before we thought of it, So, we have a lot of people who may not be implementing or actually focusing on those ideas that they have that could be really world changing, and instead are thinking, let's make a bunch of noise, let's be angry about it. And that doesn't really help. It doesn't help the problem. It just, let's get
Right.
angry about it. What do you
And
do? What's that helping? Let's do what we can with it. And when you have ideas and you think they can be, put into action, then do everything you can to follow that through, because that could be the Holy Spirit working through you.
yeah,
You know,
and a lot of these
because
actions, I mean, one thing we talk about is, a lot of these little actions, these technologies, right, that exist. I mean, I've seen technology that'll take your Tupperware, whatever, your little yogurt container and render it back to diesel, right? So
yeah,
it comes out of Japan, but then what happens is there there may be interests that say, no, we don't want that. We don't want that in Polynesia and Tahiti because it might upset the sale of you know diesel fuel from whoever. So there are forces that try to stop that kind of technology from coming out. It's totally scalable. We can apply it at the smallest community level. There's so many plastics that could be turned back into usable, and it doesn't have to be diesel. But the question I
like
have for
this
you
one.
is, so here we are. As a macroeconomist, I think about big picture. I've just said, if we ended a debt money system, you think, oh wow, like that's never going to happen, but it could. It could happen when there's an agreement amongst the leaders, the princes and the queens and the royalty, um, which we started talking about.
Right.
If there was a collective consciousness and agreement, we could change all kinds of economic systems towards this aspiration of better. So the question is, what do you think is blocking that kind of courage, that decision to move in the direction of better? Because we know that there's these alternative systems. We could stop producing as much plastic as we are. I understand right now the U.S. has already kind of contemplated investing even more billions in more plastic production capacity, when in fact we have a stockpile of plastics around the world that could easily be recycled back into usable energy and stop, polluting the ocean with it. So what do you think? Are there negative energies and barriers that are sort of precluding us from moving in the direction of, that economy of better?
Well, absolutely, there are. You know, one of the things I've talked about before is the fact that even just 20 to 30 years ago, there was more of a potential coming into the realm that was more towards the light. And in the last 10, 15 years or so, a lot of the dark energies have kind of converged and come in. And what we're seeing with that is a lot of what I call dismantling. So that dark energy comes in, and the whole purpose of dark energy or evil, whatever, is destruction.
Mm-hmm.
So
Sure.
whether it's personal destruction of an individual soul, whether it's the destruction of a community, a family, a world system, a country, it's destruction. So it's really comes down to that simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
And the purpose of the light energies, the hierarchies of the angels, is construction, creation. So
Yeah, yeah.
the destruction, the dark energy that comes in, it doesn't want to allow for the positive movement that would allow for construction, would allow for
Or
these ideas to manifest. So it's going to place obstacles and boundaries in the way.
mm-hmm.
It's going to put greed in the hearts of men and women. It's going to put obstacles in terms of like economic obstacles. It's going to put even just simple things like, well, this is the way we've always done it. It's too overwhelming. It's too complex.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Make us feel like we can't do it, rather than start taking steps. Because what happens with all things that humankind creates is we begin to take steps, and then once we just continue moving forward, eventually it comes to pass. But if we, the dark forces, if they can get a person, a place, a family, a town, a city, a country, a world to stand still, then nothing positive can come into play. And so this is how it actually affects also our individual karma, our individual purification as souls. All the dark side has to accomplish is to get us to stand still. And so
Mm,
we're seeing this
right,
on
right,
the
right.
bigger scale too. Yeah, we see this on the bigger scale as well, where okay, all the dark side has to do is get us to stand still. Because even the fact, Mark, just the fact that you threw out that idea about the economy, I immediately take that in because I know you and I know you're an economist, and I feel very clearly, okay, Mark is receiving an inspiration from the Holy Spirit. This will eventually come to pass if mankind allows it to pass. It's an inspiration coming from the Holy Spirit. But like you're experiencing in the world of economists, that
We're to
there
stand
is
still. We're to stand still, right? We're
standstill.
status quo. We can't change the system because we're so married to 60 years of the system. Uh,
Yes.
and so we keep talking about, well, we know its system's broken, but we're not going to change the system because we've built our careers around the system. Or
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, and what we don't realize is that this is, every major change that has occurred in the development of, humankind has required these kinds of transitional periods. When the car was invented, there was a period of transition from horse-drawn buggies to, engines, engine-drawn vehicles, and of course, flight. We've seen
yeah,
all kinds of transitions in flight. We've seen many, many transitions in regards to the development of all these energy sources.
yeah,
And so what we have to do now is just be willing to take those leaps of faith. One of the things I learned from my own journey, which is just a small microcosm of uh, what this all of these things represent, is that we just take each step as it's given to us. And when we do that, then we can find our way through to the other end of the spectrum. You were talking about the indigenous people, and one of the teachings of the indigenous people in the United States is the idea of the sacred hoop.
yes,
And
yes,
I've had many visions about this, and many recently again, because as I'm getting older, it's ironic. When I was young, I had this vision where I was told about the sacred hoop, and I met myself as a young woman. I met my old woman self when I was probably 20 or 30 years older than I am now. And now that I'm, 30 years older than I was when I was in my early 20s, I'm having these sacred hoop experiences where I'm seeing how this journey has come to pass, and I'm seeing what needs to happen in the next 20 or 30 years in order to complete it. The sacred hoop is a representation of a cycle of time and an objective that has to be achieved.
yeah, yeah,
And so it applies to what we have to do ecologically, what we have to do on many levels within our societies. But ecologically, it definitely applies because it will be something that takes many steps and will take some time. The idea, I think one of the things that is overwhelming people is when they say, oh, our world will end in 5 to 10 years. And, it could happen. If it does, then okay, but
yeah,
um, they predicted that in the 70s too, because they thought and it was cooling. So, there's all kinds of things where they have predicted those kinds of things and it did not come to pass. But what can we do? We start taking those steps, knowing that it's not probably feasible for us to solve the entire problem in 5 to 10 years, but going on the likelihood that we have more than 5 to 10 years.
Exactly. So I want to amplify that, because when you think back to our lives, I mean, in 100 years, you think about the climate warming has taken probably only 100 years, right? Or
Right, yeah,
150 since the combustion engine, since we ramped up our use of fossil fuels in agriculture. So that's only 100 years in a lifespan of billions of years,
right.
millions of years of this planet. And if you imagine now reversing that, so in the next 20, 30 years, we actually dramatically reduce our carbon emissions.
Yeah,
We increase the forest cover on the planet, which loves carbon, right?
yeah,
And we could easily. I mean, the models don't predict. They don't do those kind of predictions. We believe in the predictability, right, of the
mhm,
forecasts of the models. And I say they're just models of their guesses of what could be. And I said we cannot trust models. I mean, as an economist, I never get fired for predicting the wrong, economic forecast.
yeah.
Uh, right? Like, how many
It's
economists get fired for,
yeah, yeah, that's a good point.
so we
I mean, this is
believe,
true.
we believe the science, but what we know as people of faith is we also believe in prayer. We believe in the power of prayer, the
Yes,
power of manifesting what we believe in our minds. We hold in our minds can manifest, and so the power of prayer cannot be underestimated. But I wanted to get back to your sacred hoop too. I don't know if we discussed this, but I had the honor of meeting Chief Oren Lyons from the Onondaga, the Iroquois Confederacy, the
oh,
Six
that's
Nations in upstate New York a few years ago, when I walked in their longhouse, and it's the only matrilineal indigenous culture, I think one of the few functional ones remaining. That means the women elect the chiefs, and there are 49 clans for 5,000 people. And Oren Lyons is known as the Turtle Clan chief, and also the spirit or faith keeper. And he said, the important thing is this Onondaga nation are the ones who developed the peace treaty, the double row wampum treaty with George Washington. And
right.
that treaty says, and it's seashells sewn on a buckskin, two rows saying, as long as the rivers flow, we will walk side by side. And Oren said, what is coming is a circle wampum, right? So the idea of a circle wampum is what is he sees emerging. So that is a very interesting and good news. That supports the Hopi visions, the hoop. I mean, the hoop is a common metaphor, and it's also the way they think of a human being, right? A circle. So
What
everything's
does it
circle.
mean? What does it mean when a circle wampum comes in? What does that
Well,
mean?
you think about it, I often explain, Abraham Maslow, who developed the hierarchy of needs model. I
Right,
didn't know this until 2 years ago. He actually came to Alberta, my province in southern Alberta, the Blackfoot Confederacy, and he learned about the sacred hoop. Now, they didn't probably call it the medicine wheel, but interesting that he took the hoop and he turned it into a pyramid, which is our standard practice, right? We like
right.
hierarchies. And he put spiritual enlightenment at the top, and the indigenous people say, no, like the spirit stands in the east, in the sacred hoop. Spirit is in the east, the mind is in the north, the physical to the south, and emotion to the west. Or spirit is always in the east, no matter what medicine wheel you look at. So that means that
Like,
everything is in balance. That means a human being is a tire, is a hoop, right?
yes,
And
yeah,
your sacred hoop is driven by your own volition or free will.
right,
So you're given the gifts of the spirit from the creator. You're here for a reason,
right.
and you need to live a balanced life. You have to have those four aspects in balance. So the sacred hoop then is a model for the economy, right?
Interesting. How so? Tell me.
Well, no longer do you have this pyramidic structure where control is vested at the top, and that somehow, we, we're most of us are grinding our way at the lower realms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, material sufficiency, right? So many still in material poverty, and so we're all looking up at this pyramid at the top, saying, well, maybe one day I'll actually find true happiness. Happiness means well-being of your soul in the Greek. but that's not true. The economy could be based on this sacred hoop concept, where all four quadrants, mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, are held in balance, and each of us is pursuing our own sort of medicine wheel. Um,
Right.
and the whole economy now is based on a model of harmony, right? Not growth, not just pure growth for growth's sake. And you talked about. I mean, I love the words. The light wants our ease, the dark wants our dis-ease. We have lots of
Yes.
dis-ease, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
and we're so caught up in our disease that we, you know,
Yeah, and what we don't realize too is that that's exactly how the spirit of the darkness works. So a lot of people don't understand this, and it's good to know. So when you feel like a lot of resistance towards moving forward, towards something constructive, or you see a lot of obstacles throwing, that's usually something dark that is being thrown into the mix. That's an indication that destruction is being thrown into the mix. Um, and this is what you're seeing when you're saying, why is it so hard to get it on the pathway? This is why it's so hard to get it on the pathway. And part of that too is that we individually as human beings need to be more discerning about how much of our own interior is actually working for creation or destruction,
mhm,
because we can do this too and not even be aware of it, where we're, oh, this is the way it's always been done. We can be talking ourselves into standing still, or just speaking to young people here and people with ideas, whether you're young or really old, you have these ideas and you're like, oh, I don't know if it'll work, and then you don't even follow through. If you have the ideas, let the Holy Spirit energize it. Follow the steps, and the steps are always laid out for us because God guides us and gives us the next thing you need to do. And that's how we can make things manifest and make things
mhm.
actually get on the pathway, so to speak, where we can start allowing the evolution to occur, where we move from the things that we have been able to identify that are causing some of these climate problems, as well as just ecological problems with trash, um, to something that will work better. It's not really that surprising that when you literally had the Industrial Revolution in the last century, that this century would need to be the century where we have to figure out how to now take the Industrial Revolution and bring it to a technology that works in harmony with the way life works on Earth, so that we can actually, move forward in the technological advances that we're going to be creating and living with, but do so in a way that is clean, that is non-invasive to the planet, because the planet is a living entity. And we cannot, when we put, you know, tons of plastic and trash in our oceans, it's no different than literally throwing plastic trash within our own veins and arteries. You
Right.
know,
Or
that's
glyphosate
going
on
to
our food.
stifle the life out of the organism that we call home.
Right. And
Earth.
you wouldn't sprinkle Roundup or glyphosate on your cereal in the morning. But yet
Right.
that's what we're doing. We got tiny
That's so
traces of it everywhere. And like you wouldn't have that in your sugar bowl, would you?
true.
You know?
No.
And we do that
Yeah.
with eyes wide open, saying, well, that's what we need to do to control weeds. And I mean, maybe the weeds are talking to us. Maybe they're like, hey, I'm a
Well, and
dandelion. I
part
can
of
kill
part
you.
we, in terms of being fair to the people who came up with these ideas, we need to remember the evolution of these ideas as well, because I know there's a lot of I've heard a lot of talk about even like vaccines and things like this, and people have different opinions, and I'm not a medical enough person to be able to comment on the pros and cons, except to say that vaccines were developed because we had massive death coming from big epidemic illnesses that we don't suffer from anymore. And so we need to remember that, and so like even in terms of we spray crops for certain bugs because we had famine, because the bugs would eat the crops. So we have these things that we came up with ways to manage, but now we are at a different point where we have to come up with better ways to deal with those things. And I've even been hearing about things where there are new things that are being formulated that are more natural forms of protecting crops from pests, so that the crops won't, but they're not chemical. They're natural products that just kind of repel certain types of critters. And this is kind of the way that things will move forward, where we will find ways to create the protections that we're trying to create to, to prevent, the big illnesses that we've learned how to vaccinate against. Antibiotics were created. They were a a life-saving thing. And now we have to learn how to manage that as well, so that people do not become immune to antibiotics. We will find a way, but we have to take things to the next level. And that's always been the way things work in the development of technology, the development of humankind, and our culture and the way that we do things. So all these things can be managed and figured out, but we need to give people the room to throw their ideas around and experiment with their ideas, because there will be people coming in with ideas that may be able to take over. Okay, well, is there a better way to heat our buildings? Is there a better way to air condition our buildings for those who live in the desert like me? Is there a better way to run our vehicles? They're already working on interesting alternatives for those. And so, these things I think will come to pass.
Yeah. Can we switch gears a little bit to
Sure.
well, not entirely, but going back to St. Francis, he so there's a couple of themes just to maybe close on is this. So
Okay.
he gave us that, make me an instrument of your peace. And Cynthia Bourgeault,
Yes.
who's a well-known mystic and theologian, friend of Richard Rohr. I was listening to her this morning talking about surrender. So the mystery of surrender, the mystery of make me an instrument of your peace, make me empty so that you complete me, that sort of path of humility versus getting caught up in the negative energy. Literally, our anxiety is feeding the negative energy, right?
Yeah.
Which hungers for our anger or anxiety or stress. And yet here we have this other path, a path of surrender. Saint Therese talked about that of Lisieux, her abandonment. And I think there's a great beauty and joy and mystery in that. And that surrender also comes with prayer. And so that make me a channel of your peace, that St. Francis recited. And what are your reflections on those topics?
That's a great way to go segue into this part of the conversation, because I just wrote a book called The Christ of the Redemption, which covers this in quite a bit of depth, because it's a book about spiritual warfare and energetic alteration. But I utilized some ancient sacred texts in it. I utilized some ancient sacred texts from Dionysius, who was our first Catholic mystical theologian, and also Jacob Boehm, and also what's called the Flower Garland Sutra in Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism. And what this does, and this is the place where we put that surrender. Ironically, this is going to sound like an oxymoron. This is where we put surrender into action. but what I tried to do in the Christ of the Redemption was to show how the words of Dionysius, who's explaining the liturgical ceremonies in heaven, and how he's this generation of energy is, one of our first great mystics.
What time period, Marilyn?
He would be around 400 AD.
That's what I was
And
saying. The early days
yeah,
of
early
Orthodox.
days
Yeah,
Dionysius was, and Jacob Boehme would be medieval times, probably 1500s around
right,
there.
right, right.
And Jacob Boehme is one of those mystics that a lot of people have trouble reading and understanding. But why is he important? Um, the reason he's important is because he in his words, he's a very lofty mystic. He's teaching us how we do learn to surrender. He's teaching us how God moves the energy of particulate light from the heavenly spheres into the lower realms of the physical below, and
Wow.
how we can become capable of receiving it in our darkened condition, our condition of original sin, our condition of not being aware. And when we blend from Dionysius and Boehme, and we follow this path where we're allowing this to quicken and enliven and literally birth within us this ascending spirit of light and
Mm,
light that brings us forward. That's when the soul is surrendering, is when you see the soul moving up
mm,
slowly, because it's moving with the particulate light. That's surrender. But then what happens? But it can't happen without understanding this base mechanism first, because you have to take these steps in order to reach this next phase, which is demonstrated in my book, but demonstrated in many ancient sacred texts, including many Christian ones and many by Francis and Clare. Um, in the book I'm writing, it goes into the writings of the Flower Garland Sutra, which is also known as the Avatamsaka Sutra, which takes you into this higher sphere of existence and understanding, where you literally do live in surrender. You move on a flat plane above the below,
mm.
which means that you become a vehicle of God's transcendence within this world below. And the book that comes after this is going to take it even higher. But we
Stay
just got started on that one. But
like Star Wars Part 6. No.
yeah, but a big part of this, even during this book that I was writing, St. Clare came to me in mystical experiences several times and was pointing out things that I needed to change. She pointed out flaws that I had in my thinking, things that I was doing that were blocking me from this ability to surrender to God, because they were just misunderstandings I had about myself or about the way the spiritual journey. They were little tweaks that I had to make in order to be able to receive that particulate light, that thrust, which then would take me to the next level. And then I would go through these different processes, which were helping me to discard some of that old stuff. Now, how does this apply to those who are listening? It applies to every single one of us, because every one of us comes into this world with that old dark stuff that holds us to the ground. So we want to be receptive to receiving those tweaks of energy, receiving the light that is continually showered upon this world below, and allowing that light to actually fall upon us and quicken. Because if it doesn't quicken, then nothing happens. We still stay the same. We stand still in the same place. But if it quickens, if it's allowed to take root within a soul, and it quickens, then we start ascending,
Uh,
start going upwards, and that's the movement forward towards creation. And that is also the surrender. And that's what St. Clare and St. Francis both did.
yes,
St.
yes.
Francis had this, he had this understanding of his own particular call. And, by the time that he left the world, and he was only like 45 years old or so, there were already like I don't know, there were a lot of followers, over
Oh yeah.
20,000.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people already, and he could have never imagined how the Franciscan order is today, probably during his life. He may have, because he may have had actual mystical experiences about it, because he was known for having really profound mystical experiences with our Blessed Mother and with Jesus Christ.
Hmm.
But Francis was, he was obedient in the small things. And that's what made his vessel so powerful.
Mm.
And that's what I mean, because he embodied the light. He allowed himself to become an embodiment of the light. And that's what each of us has to do in our own unique way. We have to allow this body that we inhabit, to allow that particulate light that
Mhm.
Bohm is speaking of, that is constantly being shed and showered upon this physical realm below. We need to allow it to seed within our form and quicken so that we can embody that light. And all of a sudden, we go from standing still to going up this staircase.
Yes.
And then we know that each step we're taking is moving towards whatever that individual goal might be. And this applies whether you're applying this to a spiritual life, whether it's, you know, your prayer life, your spiritual gifts, out of body travel, but it also applies if you are a person who is a scientist who is trying to solve climate change issues, or if you're an economist like you, Mark, you know, trying to
Yeah.
solve the economy issues.
Yeah.
Every one of us has those gifts. So, you know, so we don't always recognize that God works this way through every human being within the context of the gifting that he has already given them. You
Yes.
know, so this idea that it only manifests as spiritual gifts is not accurate,
Not accurate.
because God has gifted people with many, many gifts. And that's, you know, we cannot survive or live or function or create without one another. And this is one of the brilliancies of St. Francis and also the First Nations, all my relations. That's what we all have to embrace. Ironically, there was, in the ghost dance religion in the 1900s, there was a
The ghost
prophecy.
dance. That's right. The ghost dance. Yeah.
Yeah, they had a prophecy. There would come a time when the white men would practice the native religion. And this is where it comes into play for absolute certain, which is all my relations.
Yeah.
What we missed as white people and in our religions is that truly we cannot create a world system that functions effectively without acknowledging that all all people of all races, all colors, all creatures, great and small, all life, including plant life, trees, flowers, you know, the sand, the rocks, the seas, all of these are our relations. And the solutions will come to us when we embrace all of our relations as being vital and ultimate importance in that bigger picture of that solution. The ecological thing has to contain all of our relations. And that's what we kind of excluded in the Industrial Revolution. We wanted to create, and we did, we created these cities that are almost like concrete little oases where a lot of life is kind of like thrown out, you know. We have to change where we recognize we have to live in communion with the natural world.
Hmm.
And we want to encourage those um, who are concerned about these things to be more receptive to the things that they might be inspired to do by God, rather than to just be angry about it or
Yeah.
protest about it. You know, we want to get people to um, receive the particulate light and start moving on the steps up instead of the standing still. And we can complain about it forever and we'll just keep standing still. It's when we all start saying, okay, well, we all have our place in this, and we're all going to honor each individual place, because there's going to probably, like we talked about with the people who are coming up with ways to clean up the oceans, people are coming up with ways to clean up the lakes and ponds. We are going to be having different people come in with different ideas, and we want to embrace that. We want to give people room to fulfill their function, of why they're incarnating at this time,
Yeah.
And so it's that simplicity, St. Francis and St. Clare, the simplicity of what they represented back in their own time is still just as relevant today. But the simplicity does come back to, brother sun, sister moon, brother bear, brother coyote. They're all our relations, and we want to remember how important that is in solving all of these problems of our climate, ecology, world. We have to bring that together.
So I wanted to, maybe we can close by, I want to give our huge listening audience who are probably on Mars or somewhere, because we have such with an amazing story of one of my oldest friends who was the dean of orthodontic school in New Orleans. I may have shared this story with you before. So thinking about the Canticle of the Sun, Brother Sun. So my friend Doug, his secretary said, this was 1 week before Katrina hit New Orleans. Secretary said, Doug, you're a man of faith. Would you take a picture of the sun with my camera? He goes, your camera? My friend has 2 PhDs, right? One in electrical engineering and one in developing handheld lasers for dental applications. So he's a smart guy. So he said, sure. So he takes her Polaroid camera and takes it outside. It takes a picture straight into the sun. And his secretary says, now show me what you got. And she looked at it and said, that's amazing. It's what I got too. And they share each other's pictures. And I have a picture of that image. It's a remarkable picture. So only with Polaroid, what is shown is that the circumference, the perimeter of the sun is blotted out. And what remains is a door, a light door, with 4 radiant arms coming out of the center of the door.
Wow.
And in the center of that crosshair. Now that's the way a medicine wheel looks, right? It has these crosshairs. I said, do you see what I see, Doug? And he said, what? I said, there's a heart in the middle of the door. And I said, that is stunning, because it suggests that through this door, God's love is shining on all of creation, and that everything orients towards the love of the sun, right? The animals, the plants, everything. And so the Canticle of the Sun is so beautifully amplified by this image taken by a scientist, right, on the eve of one of the big catastrophes. Yeah. And so I have great hope that if we pay attention to the beauty of that living thing, right, that just wants us to orient our own love towards it, then we have an important path ahead of us. And I've also been told that the word love is a verb. It's an action. It's not just a passive standing still condition, but it is an action, and we must move. So
I agree with that. And boy, that's beautiful. And it's interesting too, some of the images that we have in one of my books called Miraculous Images, Photographs Containing God's Footprints. It's some pictures that people took in Medjugorje of the miracle of the sun. And it's very similar to what you described, where their cameras are pointed towards the sun, but there's this huge doorway that opens, which they say is where the Blessed Mother comes through to speak to the people. And a lot of people have captured this with their cameras, just with their cameras. And so that's very interesting that, that he was able to capture that, and she was able to capture something similar to that too, which is something that is considered an interesting phenomenon in Medjugorje as well,
Right, right. But it's fascinating because we get the lines knock and the door shall be opened, right? Knock
Yes.
and I, enter through the door, which is a narrow door. But here
Yes.
we are. It's like, wow, that sun, that living being is shining its love on us, all of the creation.
Mm-hmm.
And what a beautiful thing to not ignore.
Yeah. And, I think one of the things that we all forget is that what matters is what we do each day, and whether or not we stand for creation or destruction in our actions, our thoughts, our deeds, and our words. And these are things that we can control every single day.
Hmm.
And, if at some point there, people have talked about there being calamities from literally the time of Christ till now. And there are calamities. We saw the tsunami of 2004. We've seen big calamities that occur in certain parts of the world. They probably will occur again. Whether or not there will be a world calamity, we don't know, because even in the New Testament, Christ says that even only God knows the time when the sun will come
Exactly.
again.
Yeah.
And so it's the only thing we control is that we choose to stand for the light, for creation every single day, rather than destruction. And when we see ourselves falling into that, because we all do, then we evaluate our actions, thoughts, words, deeds, and we are able to then correct that path so that we repeat that mistake less frequently. And as we do that, that's how we change. That's how we purify, so we want to go through that
Mm.
evaluation process. We can choose to stand for life every day, to stand for the light, stand for creation every single day. And, if the world blows up in 10 years, then, we still stood for life every day. And that's what matters, because this is not intended to be a permanent resting place anyway. This is a mortal realm. None of us are going to be here forever. So we already
But,
know that.
but we did the best we could do with the abilities we were given and the gifts we were given. That's,
Right.
build a better world, a better future, a better now. And so
Yes.
I think that is a common, hopefully, a common desirable aspiration for all of us. So
Yes,
thank you.
definitely.
Thank you, Marilyn. I think we're over no, we're never over time, but I'm sure we're over an hour now. So to be
Thank you,
continued.
Art.
Just to note, our listening audience has to understand that we had no agenda today, other than I
Nope.
thought St. Francis and the climate emergency. So